The clock in the nurse's station ticked softly, the only sound breaking the silence of the graveyard shift. Rebecca had worked night shifts at St. Mark's Hospital for over a decade, and while the quiet was a welcome change from the chaos of daytime emergencies, it often carried an unsettling edge. The empty hallways, the dimmed lights, the rhythmic hum of machinery. It was enough to play tricks on even the most seasoned mind. That night was particularly slow. A thunderstorm rumbled outside, rain streaking the windows and casting fleeting shadows across the sterile walls. Rebecca sat at her station, reviewing charts and sipping lukewarm coffee. Across from her, Ellen, another nurse, scrolled absent-mindedly through her phone. "You ever hear about 311B?" Ellen asked suddenly, breaking the monotony. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "What's that? A new room?" Ellen smirked, her eyes glinting with mischief. "Not exactly. It's more like a ghost story." Rebecca sighed, setting down her coffee. "Oh, come on. Don't tell me you're one of those nurses who believes in haunted hospital nonsense." "Hey, I'm just saying," Ellen replied, leaning closer. "There are stories. Patients disappearing, hearing voices, stuff like that. Supposedly, if you get assigned to room 311B, you're never seen again." Rebecca rolled her eyes. "And where exactly is this room supposed to be?" "That's the thing," Ellen said, lowering her voice. "It's not on any map, but people swear it exists." Rebecca chuckled, shaking her head. "You've been reading too many horror forums." Their conversation was interrupted by a beep from the nurse's station monitor. Rebecca glanced at the screen. It was Mr. Howard, a patient admitted earlier for chest pain. His vitals were stable when she last checked, but now his heart monitor showed a flatline. "Room 306, Rebecca said, standing quickly. "That's Howard. Stay here. I'll check it out." Rebecca moved briskly down the hall, her sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor. Room 306 was at the end of the corridor. When she reached the door, she hesitated. The room was dark, the blinds drawn tight, and the faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air. She flipped the light switch, illuminating the small, sterile space. The bed was empty. Frowning, Rebecca checked the bathroom. Empty. No sign of Mr. Howard anywhere. She double-checked the monitor. It was still linked to his wristband. There was no way he could have just vanished. Patients didn't simply walk out of the hospital unnoticed, especially not elderly men with heart conditions. Rebecca returned to the nurse's station. "Howard's not in his room." Ellen looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "I mean he's gone," Rebecca said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Did someone move him?" Ellen shook her head. "Not that I know of." "Check the chart." Rebecca pulled up Mr. Howard's file on the computer. Her stomach tightened when she saw the update. Transfer to room 311B. She stared at the screen, blinking in disbelief. "Very funny, Ellen." Ellen leaned over, her expression shifting from amusement to confusion. "I didn't do that." Rebecca glanced back at the hallway, her unease growing. "Then who did?" She decided to investigate. The hospital's floor map didn't show a room 311B, but the chart listed its location as being at the far end of the East Wing. Rebecca grabbed a flashlight, just in case, and made her way there, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The East Wing was eerily quiet. Most of its rooms were used for storage now, their beds and equipment covered in white sheets. The further Rebecca walked, the colder the air became, as if she were descending into a basement rather than staying on the same floor. Finally, she reached the end of the hall. There it was, an unmarked door, slightly ajar with a faint, bluish light spilling out into the hallway. Rebecca's hand tightened around the flashlight as she approached. The door creaked open under her touch, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It looked nothing like the other hospital rooms. The walls were bare concrete, the floor uneven and dusty, and a single bed sat in the center of the room, its sheets pristine and perfectly folded. Beside the bed was a heart monitor, its screen showing a steady rhythm. And there, lying on the bed, was Mr. Howard. Rebecca's breath caught. She approached slowly, the beam of her flashlight trembling slightly. "Mr. Howard?" she whispered. The man didn't respond. He was pale, his eyes closed, but his chest rose and fell steadily. She reached out to touch his arm, But the moment her fingers brushed his skin, his eyes snapped open. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice hoarse and strained. Rebecca stumbled back, her heart racing. "Mr. Howard, we need to get you back to your room. You shouldn't be here." His gaze shifted to the door, his expression twisted with fear. "It won't let me leave." "What won't?" Rebecca demanded, her voice rising. Before he could answer, the heart monitor began to beep rapidly. Rebecca turned to check it, but when she looked back, the bed was empty again. Rebecca stumbled back from the bed, her breathing erratic. The room was cold, colder than it should have been, and her flashlight flickered faintly as though its batteries were suddenly struggling. She looked around the room, but there was no sign of Mr. Howard. The bed, still perfectly made, now looked more ominous than comforting. She backed toward the door, eager to leave, but her sense of duty wouldn't let her abandon the mystery. Turning one last time toward the bed, she saw something that hadn't been there before, a folder lying neatly on the bedside table. Frowning, Rebecca approached cautiously, reaching out to pick up the folder. Its cover was blank, but inside were papers, medical records. She flipped through them, recognizing Mr. Howard's name at the top of each page. But the dates didn't make sense. The records claimed he'd been admitted to the hospital over 40 years ago. Rebecca's stomach churned. That was impossible. Mr. Howard was barely 70. He couldn't have been a patient here in his 20s. She flipped through the pages faster, her fingers trembling, until she reached the final entry. The page was blank except for 3 words scrawled in red ink. "Do not open." A cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the bluish light from the monitor. Rebecca froze, clutching the folder to her chest as the darkness pressed in around her. Then, faintly, she heard it, the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. Rebecca bolted out of the room, the folder still clutched in her hands. The hallway outside was darker than she remembered, the overhead lights dimmed to the point of uselessness. She shone her flashlight down the corridor, her breath catching as she caught movement at the far end. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. No response. The movement came again, closer this time, a shadow that seemed to melt into the walls. Rebecca's pulse quickened as she backed away, her grip on the folder tightening. The shadows inched closer, taking the faint shape of a man with features that seemed eerily familiar. "Mr. Howard," she whispered, though her instincts told her it couldn't be him. The shadow stopped just feet away, its form now more distinct. It was Mr. Howard, but his eyes were wrong, empty, hollow voids that seemed to pull at her very soul. "You shouldn't have come," the shadow whispered, its voice echoing unnaturally. Rebecca stumbled back, her flashlight flickering wildly. "What is this? What's happening?" The shadow stepped closer, raising an arm to point at the folder. "You opened the door. Now it's your turn." Before Rebecca could respond, the shadow dissolved, scattering into the darkness like smoke. Desperate for answers, Rebecca returned to the nurse's station. Ellen was gone, her chair spinning slowly as if she'd left in a hurry. Rebecca dropped the folder on the desk and logged into the hospital system, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she searched for any mention of room 311B. At first, there was nothing, but after digging deeper, she found a series of restricted files, each marked with the hospital's logo and an ominous disclaimer: "Access prohibited without authorization." Ignoring the warning, Rebecca bypassed the restrictions and opened the files. What she found chilled her to the core. Room 311B wasn't part of the hospital's original design. It had been added decades ago under the direction of a now-deceased administrator. The files described the room as an observation chamber for terminal patients, but the details were vague and contradictory. Some reports claimed the room was used for experimental treatments. Others suggested it was a quarantine zone for unexplained illnesses. But the final file told a different story. It described room 311B as a containment area for phenomena that defied medical science. Patients who entered the room reported seeing apparitions, hearing voices, and experiencing time distortions. Many died within days of their stay, their causes of death listed as undetermined. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The folder on the desk seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its pages curling as if in protest. She knew she needed to leave to report what she'd seen. But as she stood, the lights in the station flickered and died. The monitor screens went black, and the soft hum of the hospital's machinery fell silent. Then, from the darkness came a voice. "Rebecca!" She turned slowly, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Standing at the far end of the hallway was Mr. Howard, or what was left of him. His figure was transparent, his eyes hollow, and his body seemed to flicker like an old film reel. "You can't leave," he said, his voice overlapping with others. Dozens, maybe hundreds of voices, all speaking in unison. "The room has chosen you." Rebecca's flashlight fell to the floor as the shadows closed in. Rebecca's pulse thundered in her ears as the shadows closed in, whispering her name. The hallway stretched infinitely before her, the figure of Mr. Howard flickering like a mirage at its end. She couldn't breathe. The air was heavy, charged with an unnatural weight that seemed to crush her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. "You open the door," the voices whispered, weaving through her mind like smoke. "Now you must pay the price." "No!" Rebecca shouted, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to. This isn't my fault." The folder on the desk began to glow faintly, its edges curling as though it were being consumed by an invisible fire. Drawn by an irresistible compulsion, Rebecca snatched it up, clutching it tightly as though it could shield her from the encroaching darkness. Mr. Howard's form shimmered and distorted, his hollow eyes locking onto hers. "There is only one way to end this," he said, his voice reverberating unnaturally. "The room must have a keeper." "What do you mean?" Rebecca demanded, her voice rising with panic. He stepped closer, the flickering light from her fallen flashlight casting grotesque shadows across his face. "Someone must take my place," he said. "The room feeds on fear, on the boundaries between life and death. Without a keeper, it will consume everything." Rebecca shook her head, backing away. "I won't do it. I can't." The lights overhead flickered violently, and the shadows surged forward, wrapping around her like a living thing. She screamed, dropping the folder as the darkness pulled her toward the unmarked door at the end of the hall. Rebecca's screams echoed through the hospital, but no one heard them. By the time the morning shift arrived, the East Wing was quiet once more, the unmarked door sealed shut as though it had never been opened. At the nurse's station, Ellen returned to find Rebecca's ID badge lying on the desk beside an empty coffee cup. She frowned, looking around. "Rebecca," she called. No answer. Later that day, a new chart appeared in the hospital system. It was labeled Room 311B, occupant unknown. And somewhere deep in the bowels of the hospital, a new folder sat on the bedside table of Room 311B. Its cover was blank, save for 3 words scrawled in blood-red ink. "Do not open." St. Catherine's Hospital was no stranger to tragedies, but what happened in the silent ward was something no one dared to talk about. The 5th floor of the West Wing had been closed for years after a fire gutted the area, leaving only charred remains of its former use. Officially, it was declared unsafe and sealed off. But among the staff, the stories were different. Some claimed they saw shadows moving behind the boarded-up windows. Others heard faint voices, calling out names in the dead of night. And there was the story of Nurse Claudia, who vanished while working her shift 10 years ago. Claudia's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy. It was the catalyst that led to the ward being shut down. She had gone to check on a patient in room 502, a psychiatric patient who had been transferred in just days earlier. The patient's file was sparse, containing little more than a name and a vague diagnosis of psychosis with delusions. Witnesses said Claudia entered the room late that night after the patient was heard screaming. But when backup arrived minutes later, the room was empty. No patient, no nurse, just a chair toppled over and a faint, bloody handprint on the wall. 10 years later, the silent ward remained sealed, until one rainy evening when a new order came down from administration. A renovation crew had been hired to restore the floor, and the first task was to document the damages and salvageable items. That's how Anna, a fresh-faced nurse with a reputation for curiosity, found herself assigned to assist the crew. The elevator groaned to a stop on the 5th floor, its doors opening with a reluctant hiss. Anna hesitated, gripping the flashlight in her hand. She wasn't sure why she had volunteered for this task. Maybe it was her curiosity, or maybe she wanted to prove she wasn't easily shaken. Either way, as she stepped into the silent ward, the air seemed to grow colder, and the faint hum of the hospital below faded into silence. The hallway stretched before her, charred walls still bearing the scars of the fire. Broken ceiling tiles dangled precariously, and the smell of soot lingered in the air. She adjusted her flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. "Anna, are you there?" A crackling voice came through the walkie-talkie clipped to her belt. It was Jacob, the head of the renovation crew. "I'm here," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "The place looks worse than I expected." "Stick to the checklist," Jacob instructed. "Photograph anything worth documenting, and don't wander off. We'll join you soon." "Got it," she said, though the unease gnawing at her stomach made her want to argue. As Anna moved down the hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, and every creak of the floor made her heart skip a beat. She paused at room 502, the infamous room where Nurse Claudia had disappeared. The door was ajar, its brass handle tarnished and coated with dust. She shone her flashlight inside. The room was empty, its walls scorched black, and the faint outline of a toppled chair was still visible near the center. On the far wall, a faint handprint was etched into the soot, a mark that no amount of scrubbing had ever been able to remove. Anna took a deep breath and stepped inside, her flashlight beam sweeping the room. As she approached the handprint, her walkie-talkie crackled again. "Anna!" The voice wasn't Jacob's. It was softer, almost pleading, and distorted like a recording played backward. She froze, her hand instinctively going to her belt. "Jacob? Is that you?" Static answered her. Then, faintly, the voice returned. "Help me!" The air in the room grew colder, and the flashlight flickered. Anna turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Panic surged through Anna as she yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Her flashlight sputtered and died, leaving her in total darkness. "Calm down," she whispered to herself, fumbling with the walkie-talkie. "Jacob, can you hear me? I'm stuck in room 502. The static returned, louder this time, and with it came faint whispers. At first, Anna thought it was interference, but the whispers grew clearer, forming words she couldn't quite understand. Then she felt it, a cold breath against her neck. Anna spun around, her back pressing against the door. The room was pitch black, but she could sense movement, shadows shifting in the dark, circling her. Her fingers brushed against something on the wall beside her. It was a small switch. She flipped it, and a dim emergency light flickered to life. The room was empty. Relief washed over her until she noticed something new on the bedside table. A manila folder lay there, pristine and untouched by the fire. It hadn't been there before. With trembling hands, Anna picked up the folder. Inside were medical records, the patient's name at the top, Lydia Reeves. Anna's brow furrowed. The name wasn't familiar, but as she read through the file, unease settled over her. The notes described Lydia as a psychiatric patient with severe delusions, claiming she could hear the voices of the forgotten. The final entry was chilling. Transferred to room 502 for observation. Patient status, unresolved. Beneath the medical notes was a photograph. It was faded and slightly warped from heat, but the face was unmistakable. It was Nurse Claudia. "Ow," Anna whispered, her voice trailing off. The lights flickered again, and the whispers returned, louder and more frantic. "Help us," they said in unison, the voices blending into a mournful wail. The whispers grew louder, and Anna felt a pressure building in her chest. The walls seemed to close in, the room darkening despite the flickering emergency light. She clutched the folder tightly and backed toward the door, her breath quick and shallow. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, as if the entire hospital had been swallowed by an unseen force. Then, Faint footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. Anna froze, her heart pounding. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, until they stopped right outside the door. Anna, a voice called soft but commanding. She recognized it immediately. It was Claudia's voice. Tears pricked Anna's eyes as she whispered, "Claudia." The door creaked open, revealing the charred hallway beyond. But it wasn't empty. A figure stood there, its features obscured by shadows. It wore a nurse's uniform, but its body flickered like an old film reel, its edges blurring and distorting. "Why did you leave us?" the figure asked, its voice layered with anguish. Anna shook her head. I don't understand." The figure stepped closer, and the shadows around it began to shift. Faces emerged, dozens of them, their expressions twisted in pain and despair. They whispered in unison, their voices merging into one. "Set us free." The folder in Anna's hands grew unbearably hot. She dropped it, and the papers spilled across the floor. Among them was a final, handwritten note. "Burn the ward. Release the forgotten." St. Augustine's Medical Center was known for its efficiency, its staff trained to handle even the most chaotic of emergencies. But on a quiet Friday evening, a call came through that no one could have prepared for. "Ambulance 34. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. "We got a pickup. Route 17 near the old quarry. Single male, unconscious." EMTs Lisa and Ben exchanged glances. The quarry was abandoned, its surrounding roads seldom traveled. It was strange enough to get a call from such a desolate area, but what made it stranger was the timestamp on the call log. 2:38 a.m. It was only 11:45 p.m. "That can't be right," Ben muttered, tapping the screen. "We're getting a call from the future now." Lisa shrugged, trying to shake the unease settling in her chest. "Glitch in the system, maybe? Let's just get there." The ambulance wound its way through the dark countryside, its headlights cutting through the mist that clung to the narrow road. When they arrived at the location, the quarry loomed ahead, its jagged cliffs illuminated faintly by the moonlight. "Over there," Lisa said, pointing to a figure lying at the edge of the road. The man was pale, his clothes tattered and dirty, but his breathing was steady. A faint pulse thrummed beneath his cold skin as Lisa checked his vitals. "He's stable," she said, glancing at Ben. "Let's get him on the stretcher." As they lifted him, the man's eyes fluttered open. He stared at Lisa, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Don't take me back," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lisa hesitated, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" The man's grip tightened on her arm, his fingers ice cold. "Don't take me back." And then he passed out again. When they arrived at the hospital, the man was admitted to room 407, a standard private room in the recovery ward. Lisa handed off her notes to the attending physician, but she couldn't shake the man's words. "Don't take me back," she muttered to herself as she walked to the break room. The hospital buzzed with its usual midnight energy. Nurses bustling between rooms, monitors beeping softly, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Lisa poured herself a cup of coffee, trying to focus on her next shift. But room 407 stayed in the back of her mind. Around 3 a.m., she decided to check on the patient. As she approached the room, she noticed something strange. The air outside the door was cold. Unnaturally so. She paused, rubbing her arms, and peered inside. The man was sitting up in bed, staring directly at the door. Lisa's heart leapt. "You're awake," she said, stepping inside. "How are you feeling?" The man didn't answer. His eyes followed her as she moved to check his for. "You gave us quite the scare," she said, trying to fill the silence. "Do you remember what happened?" The man's lips parted slightly. "You shouldn't have brought me here." Lisa frowned. "You were unconscious on the side of the road. We didn't have a choice." The man's expression darkened. "You've made a mistake. It knows I'm here now." "Who knows?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the window, his body tense. Lisa followed his gaze, but the view outside was normal, the dim parking lot lit by orange streetlights. "I need to leave," he said suddenly, throwing off the blankets. "You can't," Lisa replied, stepping in front of him. "You're not stable yet." The man grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. "You don't understand. If I stay, it'll come for all of us." Lisa tried to calm the man, but his panic was contagious. His breathing quickened, and his eyes darted to the door. "Please," he begged. "Let me go. It'll stop if I leave." Before Lisa could respond, the lights flickered. The room was plunged into momentary darkness, and when the light returned, the man was standing beside her, his face inches from hers. "Do you see it?" he whispered. "See what?" Lisa asked, her voice shaking. He pointed to the door. Lisa turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. The hallway beyond was dark, the overhead lights flickering erratically. At first she saw nothing, and then it moved. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, shifted at the far end of the corridor. It wasn't a person. It had no defined shape, but it moved with purpose, gliding silently toward room 407. Lisa's breath caught as the shadow reached the door. The man grabbed her arm, pulling her away. "It's here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's found me." The shadow seeped into the room like smoke, curling along the walls and ceiling. The man collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest as Lisa backed into the corner. "What is it?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "The Keeper," the man gasped. "It collects those who escape." Lisa's mind raced. Escape from where? The quarry? The hospital? The shadow enveloped the man, its tendrils tightening around him. He screamed, a sound so raw and primal that it seemed to shake the walls. Lisa covered her ears, tears streaming down her face as the lights flickered violently. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The room fell silent. Lisa opened her eyes. The man was gone. Not a trace of him remained, not even an indent in the bed. She stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. The hospital was still, empty. Every door she passed was ajar, the rooms inside dark and silent. The nurse's station was abandoned, the monitors black. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing unnaturally. No response. She turned back toward room 407, but the door was gone. In its place was a blank wall. The days that followed were a blur for Lisa. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened that night. The patient, the shadow, the room that disappeared. When she tried to report the incident to her supervisor, she was met with confusion. "There is no room 407, they told her. She insisted, showing them her notes, the patient log, and the intake records from the ambulance. But when they checked the system, there was no record of the patient. His file was gone, wiped clean as though he had never existed. Lisa was placed on leave pending an evaluation. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. At night, in her apartment, she would hear faint whispers, soft at first, but growing louder as the hours stretched on. Sometimes, she'd glance at her reflection in the mirror and see the shadow lingering just behind her. Unable to bear it any longer, she returned to the hospital one final time. The 5th floor was quiet, the hallways empty. Lisa stood where room 407 had been, her hand brushing against the cold, smooth wall. A faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, and for a moment, she swore she heard his voice. "Don't take me back!" And then, just as quickly, it was gone. Lisa turned and walked away, the whispers following her as she disappeared into the night. Room 407 was never spoken of again.